In the soft green country of South Devon, where the land folds gently down toward the water in a series of wooded valleys, there is a small parish whose registers reach back into the middle years of the 17th century. The ink in those old books has faded to the colour of weak tea, and the hands that wrote in them were not always careful, so that names blur and dates slip, and a person born there might leave only the faintest mark of ever having lived at all. Somewhere in those pages, most historians believe, is the record of a boy who would one day carry the largest single fortune ever taken by a pirate out of the waters of the world, and then walk so completely out of history that no one has ever been certain where he died, or when, or under what name. He was born, the best guesses say, around the year 1659, near the town of Newton Ferrers, within sound of the sea that would define and then consume him. His name, as it came down to us, was Henry Every, though even that is uncertain, for he was known also as Avery and as Bridgeman, and by other names besides, and the multiplication of his names is itself a kind of foreshadowing, as though the man had always been more rumour than fact. He was ordinary in his beginnings. He was a child of the West Country, that long coastline of fishing villages and small harbours and tin mining hills, where the ships came and went with the tides, and where a boy who looked out at the water would have understood, without ever being told, that the horizon was a door that opened outward into the whole trading world. It is worth pausing at the very edge of his life before the story begins to move, because everything that made Henry Every extraordinary grew out of how thoroughly ordinary he began. He was not born to wealth. He carried no title. He inherited no ship and no name that would open doors for him in the counting houses of London. Whatever he became, he built out of the plain materials that the age handed to a poor and capable seaman, and the age handed such men very little except danger, and the faint, glittering promise that danger might one day be traded for gold. The 17th century was drawing toward its close as he grew, and England was becoming, slowly and often clumsily, a nation whose power reached across oceans. Spanish silver had proven that the sea could be a river of treasure. Dutch shipping had shown that trade could make a small country immensely rich. And in the ports of England, men who had once thought of the world as ending at the coast of France now spoke casually of the Indies, of the Guinea coast, of the Red Sea, and the ports of the Mughal Empire, as though these places were merely distant streets in a city that spanned the globe. Into this widening world, Henry Every went to sea, as thousands of West Country boys did, learning the trade of a sailor in the hard school of wind and salt and rope. What we know of his early years is thin, and much of it must be pieced together from later documents that mention him only in passing, as one names a stranger whose importance became clear only afterward. He seems to have served in the Royal Navy for a time, in the wars that England fought against France in those decades, and to have risen to some modest rank, perhaps that of a master's mate, a man who understood navigation and the handling of a ship well enough to be trusted with real responsibility. He would have learned in that service the discipline of the naval world, the endless labor of keeping a wooden vessel alive, the way a crew becomes a single organism bound together by routine and hardship. He would also have learned its bitterness, for the pay was poor and often late, the food was worse, and a common sailor could spend years at sea and come home with almost nothing to show for it but scars and salt-cracked hands. That bitterness matters, because it is the soil in which everything that followed took root. Henry Every did not become what he became out of nothing. He became it out of the ordinary grievance of the ordinary sailor, magnified and finally set loose. If these quiet chronicles of the sea and the vessels it swallowed have found a place in the still hours of the evening, and if the slow unwinding of one man's long-vanished voyage is the kind of story that keeps gentle company at the close of a day, then you are warmly invited to follow along with the channel so that more of these lost voyages might drift toward you on nights such as this one. And now, having offered that quiet invitation, the tale can settle back into its proper current and carry on unhurried toward the sea. After the Navy, the records suggest, every drifted into darker trades, as many seamen of his time did when honest work ran out. There are indications that he sailed in the Atlantic slave trade, that grim commerce which moved human beings across the ocean as though they were cargo, and which enriched a great many respectable men who never once set foot on the ships that did the carrying. If every did indeed work in that trade, and the evidence leans that way, then he had already crossed a moral line long before he ever raised a black flag. For there was nothing in the taking of a treasure ship that was crueler than the ordinary daily business of a slaver. This is one of the quiet truths that the story of piracy keeps returning to. The line between the pirate and the legitimate merchant, between the outlaw and the servant of the crown, was often far thinner than the men on either side of it wished to admit. The same ocean carried the same kinds of men on the same kinds of ships, and what separated them was frequently no more than a piece of paper, a letter of authority, a flag hoisted or hauled down. Every would spend the middle of his life on the legitimate side of that line, and then, in a single night, step across it forever. By the early 1690s, he was a man of perhaps 35 years, seasoned, capable, and, like so many of his kind, unrewarded. He had given his working life to the sea, and the sea had given him little back. He was not a young man dreaming of adventure. He was a middle-aged professional who had watched the years pass and the money never arrive, and who had begun, one imagines, to feel the particular weariness of a man who suspects he has been cheated by the whole arrangement of the world. It was in this state of mind, seasoned and disappointed and quietly dangerous, that he took the position that would change everything. He signed on as first mate aboard a well-armed ship, being fitted out for a grand and, on paper, entirely lawful enterprise, an enterprise that promised riches to all who joined it and delivered, at first, only delay, hunger, and the slow curdling of hope into resentment. The ship was named the Charles II after the late king, and she was bound, or so her backers intended, for the West Indies and a fortune in Spanish treasure. She would never reach the West Indies. What she would reach instead, under a new name and a new master, was a place in history that none of the men who fitted her out could ever have foreseen. It is a strange thing to stand at the beginning of a life like this and know already how thoroughly it will end in silence. The story of Henry Every is not, in the end, a story of a man who was caught and punished, and whose fate was written down for all to read. It is a story of a man who vanished, and whose vanishing was so complete that it became, in its own way, more famous than any capture could have been. In the years after his great theft, ballads were sung about him in the streets of London. A play was written and performed upon the stage, imagining his adventures and his end, none of it true. Sailors in distant ports whispered that he had become a king upon some hidden island, that he ruled a pirate nation from a throne of plundered gold, that he had married a captured princess and founded a dynasty. Others said, more soberly, that he had crept home to the West Country under a false name and died there in poverty, cheated at the last by the very merchants he had trusted to launder his fortune, so that the man who had taken more treasure than any pirate in history ended his days without enough money to buy his own coffin. Both stories cannot be true. Perhaps neither is. The honest answer is that no one knows, and that the not knowing is the truest thing about him. For the moment, though, all of that lies far ahead. For the moment there is only the sea off Devon, and a boy watching the ships, and the slow accumulation of a working life spent on salt water. There is a young man learning the stars and the set of the sails. and an older man growing quietly bitter at the unfairness of it all, and a ship named for a dead king waiting at anchor in a foreign harbour, for a voyage that would never sail as planned. The pieces were assembling themselves, as the pieces of such stories do, without any of the people involved understanding what they were building. And somewhere in the green valleys of South Devon, a parish register held a faded name that would one day be spoken in fear from the courts of Delhi to the counting houses of London, though the ink itself would never know it. To understand how a disappointed first mate became the most hunted man in the world, it is necessary first to understand the world he lived in, the trades that shaped him, and the long apprenticeship in danger that prepared him for the single, reckless act that made his name. That apprenticeship is where the story turns next, in the hard and unglamorous decades of a sailor's working life, among the slave ships and the naval vessels and the merchant hulls that carried a whole generation of West Country men out into an ocean that promised everything and, to most of them, delivered nothing at all. To understand the world into which Henry Every sailed, it helps to set aside the later image of the pirate, the flag with its skull, the cutlass and the parrot, and the buried chest, all of which belong more to the imagination of later centuries than to the salt-stained reality of the 1690s. The real world of the late 17th century sea was a place of enormous distances and painfully slow communication, where a ship that left an English port might not be heard from for a year or more, where news travelled only as fast as the fastest hull could carry it, and where a man who wished to disappear had only to sail beyond the edge of the known charts and wait. It was a world in which the great trading companies of Europe were carving up the oceans between them, planting fortified warehouses on distant coasts, and treating the sea lanes as highways of wealth to be defended and, where possible, monopolized. The English East India Company, chartered nearly a century before, had grown from a modest association of merchants into a power that maintained its own fleets and forts and armed men, and that spoke to the rulers of India not merely as traders, but as a kind of state unto itself. The company's ships carried spices and cloth and saltpeter and, increasingly, silver and gold. And where such riches moved across the water, other men were always watching. The seamen who crewed these ships lived hard lives. A merchant sailor or a naval rating of that era existed at the bottom of a rigid order, subject to the will of officers who could flog him for small offences, fed on salted meat and weevil-ridden biscuit, packed into damp and crowded quarters where disease moved freely and where the ordinary hazards of the work, falls from the rigging, crushed limbs, drowning, were simply accepted as the price of the trade. The pay was low and frequently withheld, sometimes for months, sometimes forever. For a ship owner who wished to cheat his crew had many ways to do it, and a sailor far from home had little recourse. Out of this arrangement grew a deep and abiding sense of grievance among the men of the lower deck, a feeling that they gave their labour and their bodies and their years to a system that returned them almost nothing, and that the wealth their hands moved across the world flowed always upward, into the pockets of men who never smelled the bilge or felt the lash. Piracy, when it came, was never merely greed. It was also, always, a kind of answer to that grievance, a turning of the whole cruel arrangement upside down, so that for a brief and doomed season, the men who had always been at the bottom could take for themselves the treasure they had spent their lives carrying for others. Henry Every came up through this world and absorbed its lessons. In the wars against France, which occupied much of the 1680s and 90s, the Royal Navy expanded and swallowed up experienced seamen wherever it could find them, sometimes by the harsh method of the press gang, which seized men off the streets and out of taverns and dragged them aboard warships against their will. Every, by most accounts, served willingly and served well, rising through skill and steadiness to a position of trust. He learned navigation, the difficult art of finding one's position on a featureless ocean by the sun and stars and the careful reckoning of speed and time. He learned gunnery, the handling of the heavy cannon that turned a wooden ship into a floating fortress. He learned command, the subtle business of bending a crew of hard and independent men to a single purpose, which is a skill quite different from mere authority, and which he seems to have possessed to an unusual degree. Men who later sailed under him described him as calm, capable, and persuasive, a leader who ruled less by fear than by a kind of steady confidence that made others willing to follow him into ventures they might otherwise have refused. This gift would prove decisive. A lesser man might have nursed his grievances in silence and died an obscure and disappointed sailor. Every had the rarer ability to gather other men's grievances to his own and forge them into action. Between his naval service and the voyage that made him infamous, the record grows dim, and it is here that the shadow of the slave trade falls across his story. There are strong indications that he spent time in the commerce of the Guinea coast, that stretch of West Africa, from which European ships carried enslaved men, women, and children to the plantations of the Americas. The trade was, by the standards of its own time, entirely respectable. Kings invested in it. Great companies were chartered to conduct it. Churchmen blessed it, and gentlemen grew wealthy from it. And the human misery on which it rested was, to most of the men who profited, simply invisible. A fact of business no more remarkable than the price of sugar. If Henry Every worked in this trade, and it appears he did, then he had already spent years participating in a cruelty far vaster and more systematic than anything he would later do upon the open sea. And he had done so with the full approval of law and custom and church. There is a hard irony in this, and the story of piracy returns to it again and again. The men who were hunted across the world as monsters had very often learned their trade in the service of enterprises that the world called honorable, and the difference between the celebrated merchant and the hanged pirate was frequently a matter of paperwork rather than of conscience. By the time we can see him clearly again, in the middle years of the 1690s, Henry Avery was a mature and thoroughly experienced seaman, a man who had spent decades at sea and knew every aspect of the trade, from the setting of a topsail in a rising wind to the reckoning of a course across an empty ocean to the management of frightened and mutinous men. He knew the sea lanes of the Atlantic and, crucially, he knew of the immense wealth that moved across the Indian Ocean each year, the treasure of an empire vaster and richer than any in Europe, carried in great ships that were poorly defended because no one had ever seriously dared to trouble them. He knew, in short, exactly where the greatest treasure in the world could be found, and he had spent his whole life acquiring precisely the skills a man would need to take it. All that was missing was the opportunity, and the opportunity, when it came, arrived disguised as an entirely ordinary job. In the autumn of 1693, a group of London merchants was fitting out an expedition, and they needed an experienced first mate for one of their ships. The venture was legal, ambitious, and, on paper, richly promising. It was also, though none of its backers could have known it, the fuse that would light the whole affair. To that venture and to the long and ruinous delay that turned an honest voyage into the greatest theft in the history of the sea, the story now turns. It is worth lingering a moment longer on the ships themselves, for the vessel is as much a character in this story as any man who sailed her. The armed merchantman of the late 17th century was a marvel of accumulated craft, built of oak grown slowly in English and northern forests, shaped by shipwrights who worked largely by eye and long tradition rather than by any exact science. Such a ship might carry 30 or 40 or 50 guns, iron cannon that threw solid shot, heavy enough to shatter timber and bone. And she was designed to be both a carrier of cargo and, when the need arose, a floating castle capable of defending herself against pirates and privateers and the warships of rival nations. She was slow to build, expensive to fit out, and utterly dependent on the skill and willingness of the men who crewed her. For a ship of that age required constant labor merely to stay afloat and alive. The rigging had to be tended, the sails set and reefed and mended, the hull pumped free of the water that always seeped in, the guns kept dry and ready, the food and water rationed and guarded against the long weeks between ports. A crew that lost heart or lost faith in its officers could bring even the finest ship to ruin. And the officers of the age knew this and governed accordingly, balancing discipline against the constant danger that discipline pushed too far would curdle into mutiny. The merchants who fitted out the expedition that would carry Henry, every to infamy, were men of the City of London, investors and speculators who saw in the disorder of the age an opportunity for profit. Their scheme, grandly styled the Spanish expedition shipping, was built upon an arrangement with the Spanish crown, which at that time held vast territories in the Americas, but lacked the ships and men to defend and supply them properly. The plan was for a small squadron of well-armed English vessels to sail to the Spanish West Indies, where they would be licensed by the Spanish authorities to trade, to recover sunken treasure, and to drive off the French smugglers and privateers who preyed upon Spanish commerce in those waters. It was, in theory, a lawful and even a patriotic enterprise, blessed by the alliance between England and Spain against the common enemy of France, and it promised handsome returns to everyone involved, from the great investors down to the ordinary seamen who would share in the profits. 4 ships were made ready, and the finest of them, a powerful vessel of 40-odd guns, was named the Charles II. To her, as first mate, came Henry Every, a man of proven skill and quiet ambition, signing on to what looked, on the face of it, like the most promising voyage of his long career. He could not have known, and neither could the merchants counting their expected profits in their comfortable London offices, that the venture's very first misfortune, a delay that should have been trivial, would stretch and fester until it broke the whole enterprise apart and set loose upon the world a name that kings would come to dread. The squadron sailed from England in the summer of 1693 and made its way south along the coast of Europe to the port of A Coruña, on the northwestern shoulder of Spain, a harbour the English sailors called the Groin. There the ships were to complete their arrangements with the Spanish authorities, take on final supplies and papers, and receive the licenses that would make their coming ventures in the Indies lawful. It should have been a matter of weeks. Instead, it became a matter of months, and then of many months, as the whole enterprise sank slowly into a swamp of delay from which it never emerged. The Spanish paperwork did not arrive. The promised licenses were held up in the machinery of a distant and unhurried bureaucracy. Messages went back and forth across Europe at the crawling pace of the age, and each exchange consumed more weeks. And still the ships sat at anchor in the Groin, going nowhere, while the season for a profitable crossing slipped away, and the men aboard grew restless, and then bitter, and then quietly, dangerously angry. For the ordinary seaman, the delay was more than an inconvenience. It was a slow starvation of hope. The men had signed on for a voyage that promised profit, and instead they found themselves trapped in a foreign port with no work, no prospect of the riches they had been promised, and, most galling of all, no pay. Their wages had gone unpaid for months, and the merchants who owed them showed no sign of settling the debt. Some accounts say the men had received almost nothing since leaving England. They were far from home, dependent on the goodwill of a foreign authority that regarded them with suspicion, unable to leave and unwilling to stay, watching the days pile up into weeks and the weeks into seasons while their hoped-for fortune dissolved into nothing. A ship's crew in such a state is a dangerous thing. A boiler with the fire lit, and the safety valve rusted shut, and the officers of the squadron would have known it, and would have watched the growing sullenness of the men with the particular unease of those who understand exactly how such situations end. Henry Elvery was among them, and his position was a peculiar one. As first mate, he stood between the ordinary sailors and the captain, a man of the lower deck by origin, who had risen into the officer class by skill, and who therefore understood the grievances of the crew from the inside, even as his rank placed him among those responsible for keeping order. He listened, he watched, and somewhere in the long, idle months at anchor in the groin, in the endless conversations of frustrated men with nothing to do but nurse their anger, a plan began to take shape. It is impossible now to say exactly when Every decided to seize the ship, or whether the decision was his alone, or grew up among a group of the most discontented men, with Every simply the ablest and most trusted of them, the natural leader that a leaderless mutiny required. What is clear is that, by the spring of 1694, the mood aboard the Charles II had passed the point of mere complaint and entered the realm of conspiracy, and that Henry Every stood at the centre of it, the calm and capable figure around whom the desperate men gathered. There is a story, difficult to verify but often repeated, that Every and the disaffected men aboard his ship made contact with the crew of another vessel in the squadron, and that a wider mutiny was planned, to be launched on a signal. The plan, in this telling, was betrayed or mistimed, so that in the end only Every's ship rose. Whatever the precise truth, the essential situation is clear enough. A large and well-armed ship lay at anchor in a foreign harbour, crewed by men who had been cheated of their wages, denied the voyage they had been promised, and left to rot in idleness for the better part of a year. They were experienced seamen, skilled in the handling of the vessel and the working of her guns, and they had among them a leader of unusual ability who had concluded that the arrangement of the world had cheated him and his fellows once too often. The materials for a mutiny do not come more perfectly assembled than that. All that remained was the moment, and the moment was chosen for a night in early May, when the captain of the Charles II lay ill and heavily drunk in his cabin, and the watch was thin, and the darkness lay over the harbour of the Groin like a covering held out for the taking. It is a curious feature of Every's whole career that the pivotal moments unfolded not in the heat of chaos, but in a kind of eerie calm. He was not a man who acted in a frenzy. He planned, he waited, he chose his moment, and when the moment came, he moved with a steadiness that his followers found reassuring, and his victims found unnerving. The seizure of the Charles II would bear this signature. It was not to be a wild and disorderly uprising, but a quiet and almost orderly transfer of power, conducted under cover of darkness by men who knew exactly what they were doing and who had, by then, very little left to lose. Some of the crew were in on the plan. Others would be given a choice, once the ship was taken, to join the venture or be set ashore. And the officers who would not join, chief among them the sick captain in his cabin, would find that the ship they thought they commanded had, in the space of a single night, passed entirely out of their hands and into the hands of a first mate who was about to become something the world had no comfortable name for. The tragedy and the strange grandeur of the thing lay in how understandable it all was. These were not men born to villainy. They were sailors who had been wronged in the small, grinding, everyday way that sailors were wronged in that age, cheated of their pay and their voyage and their time, and who had decided, having nothing left to hope for within the law, to seek their fortune outside it. The step they were about to take would place them beyond the protection of every government on earth and make them the lawful prey of any warship that could catch them. It would end, for most of them, at the end of a rope or at the bottom of the sea, and yet, on that night in the harbour of the Groin, with the promised fortune long since turned to ash, and the merchants of London counting their losses, and the Spanish licenses still lost somewhere in the machinery of empire. It must have seemed to the men aboard the Charles II that they had nothing to lose and a world to gain. They were wrong about the nothing to lose, but about the world to gain, at least for a season, they would prove to be more right than any of them could have imagined. The ship was about to be reborn under a new name, and her new name would soon be spoken with dread in ports on the far side of the earth. There is something almost melancholy in imagining that harbour in the last hours before the ship changed hands, the quiet water of the groin holding the reflections of the anchored vessels, the town of A Coruña dark upon its hill, the officers asleep in their cabins, believing themselves still in command of their small floating world. The men who were about to overturn that world moved among the shadows of the deck with the deliberate quiet of those who have rehearsed a thing many times in their minds. They knew which of their fellows could be trusted and which could not. They knew where the arms were kept and how the watch was set. They knew that once the thing began, there could be no turning back, that the first act of raising a hand against a lawful captain would brand them all for whatever remained of their lives. And still they went forward, because the alternative, the slow return to a life of unpaid labor and daily grievance, had become for them a kind of death that a quicker and more honest death seemed almost preferable to. It is easy, from a distance of centuries, to see only the crime that was about to be committed. It is harder and more truthful to see the long accumulation of smaller wrongs that had made honest men ready to become outlaws, and to feel, beneath the coming lawlessness, the very human weight of despair that had brought them to it. That weight is the true beginning of the legend, and it is worth carrying forward into the events that followed, so that the men who took the Charles II are remembered not as figures from a children's tale of pirates, but as what they truly were. Ordinary and desperate seamen at the end of their patience, about to sail out of the law and into a story that would outlast them all by centuries. The night the mutiny came, the harbour of A Coruña lay still under a sky thick with cloud, and the men of the Charles II moved to their appointed places with the quiet efficiency of a crew that had done everything but this 1,000 times before. There was, by the accounts that survive, remarkably little disorder. The conspirators secured the arms and took possession of the ship's key points, the wheel, the powder store, the officers' quarters, before most of those who were not in the plot had any notion that anything was amiss. A boat put off from the ship in the darkness, sent to warn or to fetch, and its coming and going added to the confusion of the loyal officers, who woke to find that the vessel had already slipped beyond their control. The captain, ill and befuddled, was confronted in his cabin. He was not harmed. Every, whatever else he was, had no appetite for needless cruelty, and the seizure of the ship was carried through with a restraint that later observers found almost as remarkable as the boldness of the act itself. The captain was offered a choice, as were all the men aboard who had not been party to the plan. They could join the venture and share in whatever fortune it might bring, or they could take to the boats and go ashore, free to make their way home and carry the news of what had happened. A number chose to leave, the captain among them. A larger number, seasoned seamen with little to lose and much to gain, chose to stay. So the ship passed, in the space of a single quiet night, from a lawful merchantman into an outlaw vessel, and her new masters gathered on her deck to settle the matter of who should command her. In this, too, the affair bore the peculiar stamp of its origins. The men did not simply follow the strongest or the loudest. They held, in effect, an election, in the rough, democratic fashion that would come to characterize the pirate crews of that golden and doomed age. A ship taken by mutiny belonged, in the eyes of the men who had taken her, to all of them equally, and the choice of a captain was a choice they made together, weighing the candidates by their skill and their steadiness and their power to inspire confidence. There was, by every account, only one serious candidate. Henry Every had been the mind and the steadying hand of the whole enterprise, the man the others trusted, the officer who understood both the working of the ship and the temper of the crew. They chose him, and in choosing him, they bound their fortunes to his, and he accepted the command that would carry his name out of obscurity and into the fearful whispers of the whole trading world. One of his first acts as captain was to give the ship a new name, and the name he chose was a small poem of defiance and hope. He called her the Fancy. It was a light and almost playful word for a vessel that was about to become one of the most feared ships on two oceans. And perhaps that was the point, a gesture of the freedom the men had seized, a shrugging off of the heavy and respectable name of a dead king in favor of something that belonged entirely to themselves. The Fancy she became, and under that name she would earn a reputation that far outran the truth of her, so that in the ports of the Indian Ocean, her mere appearance on the horizon would soon be enough to send merchant captains crowding on all sail in flight. But that lay ahead. For the moment, she was simply a stolen ship in a Spanish harbor, crewed by men who had just made themselves outlaws, and the first business of her new captain was to get her clear of the groin and out into the open Atlantic before any warship could be roused to stop them. This they accomplished cleanly. The Fancy slipped out of the harbor and turned south, running down toward the coast of Africa, and the news of the mutiny made its slow way back to England and to the merchants whose grand expedition had just dissolved into disaster. For the investors of the Spanish expedition shipping, the seizure of their finest ship was a ruin, the collapse of a venture into which they had poured a fortune, and they raised what alarm they could, but the alarm traveled at the speed of the age, which is to say slowly, and by the time it reached anyone who might have acted upon it, the Fancy was long gone into the wide anonymity of the sea. This was the great advantage that the pirates of that era enjoyed, and Every understood it perfectly. A ship that vanished over the horizon was, for months at a time, simply beyond the reach of any law, free to go where it pleased and take what it could, answerable to nothing but the weather and the sea. The whole strategy of Every's coming venture rested upon this fact. He meant to sail to the far side of the world, to waters where the treasure was richest and the defenses thinnest, and to do his work there, thousands of miles from any power that could easily pursue him, and then to vanish again before the slow machinery of retribution could grind into motion. Before he could reach those distant waters, though, there was the long voyage south to be made, and along the way, the Fancy began the work that would build both her fortune and her reputation. She was already a powerful ship, but Every made her more so. At some point in the early stages of the voyage, the story goes, he had her hull cleaned and her lines altered to make her faster, so that she could outrun anything she could not outfight and outfight anything she could not outrun. The ideal combination for a vessel that lived by pursuit and flight. He recruited more men where he could, taking on hands from ships he encountered, some willingly and some under a pressure that left them little real choice. And he began to take prizes, small ones at first, merchant vessels met along the African coast, relieving them of their cargoes and their useful men and their news of what lay ahead. Each capture added to the Fancy's strength and to the growing legend of her captain, and each drew Henry. Every further from any possibility of return to an honest life. He was committed now, fully and finally, to the outlaw's road, and the road led east, around the great shoulder of Africa, toward the warm and treasure-laden waters of the Indian Ocean, where the richest prize in the world was even then being made ready for a voyage of its own, all unknowing that a stolen ship named for a whim was coming to meet it across half the world. There is a detail from these early months that captures the strange spirit of the enterprise, and that is the letter Every is said to have written and left where other English ships might find it. a message addressed to the commanders of English vessels, declaring that he intended no harm to his own countrymen and would let English ships pass unmolested, asking only that they not trouble him. Whether the letter was genuine or a later invention, or a shrewd piece of misdirection meant to lull the very ships he intended to rob, is impossible now to say, but it fits the pattern of the man who seems always to have understood that reputation was a weapon as powerful as any cannon. A pirate who was believed to be reasonable, who spared his countrymen and kept a kind of order, was a pirate whom frightened merchants might be tempted to bargain with rather than fight. And a fight avoided was a ship taken cheaply. Every played this game with skill throughout his brief and dazzling career, cultivating an image of himself as a gentleman of fortune rather than a common thief. And the image took hold so thoroughly that within a few years it had grown into a full-blown legend, complete with an imaginary kingdom and an imaginary crown, none of it true, all of it flowing from the calculated calm of a man who understood that what people believed about him mattered nearly as much as what he actually did. The Fancy sailed on, southward and then eastward, gathering strength and rumour as she went. And ahead of her, unseen beyond the curve of the world, lay the waters where the whole story would come to its terrible and glittering climax. The passage around the southern tip of Africa was one of the great ordeals of the age of sail, a stretch of ocean where the warm currents of two great seas collided, and the winds could rise without warning into a fury that tested even the finest ships and the ablest crews. The Fancy weathered it, as she weathered everything in her short career, and passed out of the Atlantic into the Indian Ocean, into waters that were, for a European pirate, something close to paradise. Here were the richest trade routes on earth, the arteries of an oceanic commerce far older and far grander than anything Europe had yet built, carrying the goods of India and Arabia and the East Indies across a warm and crowded sea. And here, too, was a scattering of islands and coasts where a ship beyond the law could find shelter, water, and repair, far from the reach of any European government. Chief among these havens was the great island of Madagascar, lying off the southeastern coast of Africa, whose sheltered bays and abundant provisions had made it, by the 1690s, a gathering place for the outlaws of every nation, a kind of unofficial republic of pirates, where the men who had turned their backs on the law of the land could rest and refit and plan their next ventures in relative safety. To Madagascar and the smaller islands nearby, the Fancy came, and there every found himself among his own kind, in a loose and lawless brotherhood of sea rovers drawn from every seafaring nation of Europe and the Americas. These were men who had made the same choice he had made, who lived by the taking of ships and the sharing of plunder, and who had developed, in their strange floating society, a set of customs and understandings that governed their dealings with one another. They elected their captains as every's crew had elected him. They divided their spoils by agreed shares, with the captain and the officers taking somewhat more than the common hands, but not so much more as to breed resentment. They made and unmade alliances as opportunity dictated, sometimes sailing together in temporary fleets to take on prizes too strong for any single ship, then scattering again to pursue their separate fortunes. It was into this world that Henry every now moved, and his ship, the powerful and fast-sailing Fancy, made him at once a figure of consequence among the rovers of the Indian Ocean. A well-armed vessel with a bold and capable captain was a valuable ally in any joint venture, and every, with his gift for command and his growing reputation, was soon a leading man among the pirates of those waters. It is worth pausing here to consider the texture of daily life aboard a ship such as the Fancy, for the reality of it was far removed from the romance that later ages would drape over it. A pirate ship was, first and last, a crowded and labouring thing, and the men who lived upon her spent the overwhelming majority of their hours not in battle or plunder, but in the endless ordinary work of keeping a wooden vessel alive upon a difficult sea. There were sails to be set and taken in as the wind shifted, ropes to be spliced and tarred, the hull to be pumped clear of the water that always found its way in, the decks to be scrubbed, the guns to be tended against the corrosion of the salt air, and the 1,000 small repairs that a ship in constant use forever demanded. There was food to be prepared, such as it was, the salted meat and the hard biscuit, and the dwindling casks of water that grew fouler with every week away from a friendly shore. And there were the long, empty stretches of an ocean voyage, the days and weeks when nothing happened at all, when the ship crept across a featureless expanse of water under a wide and empty sky, and the men, with little to do, fell into the boredom and the small quarrels and the quiet homesickness that were as much a part of the sailor's life as any danger. The Fancy, for all the fearsome reputation her name would earn, was in her daily reality a hard and cramped and often tedious place, and the men who sailed her endured much the same discomforts as the crews of the honest merchantmen they preyed upon, differing from them chiefly in the manner by which they hoped their labour would be rewarded. What set the pirate ship apart from the merchantman was not the work, but the order that governed it, the peculiar code by which such crews arranged their affairs among themselves. Before setting out upon a venture, the men of a pirate ship commonly drew up and agreed to a set of articles, a kind of written compact that laid down the rules of their common life, the division of any plunder, the compensation to be paid for wounds, the punishments for theft or cowardice, or the breaking of faith among them. These articles were sworn to by every man, and they governed the ship with a rough but real fairness that the ordinary maritime world, with its rigid hierarchy and its casual cruelties, entirely lacked. The captain was elected and could be removed. The spoils were shared by agreed proportions that gave every man his due. A sailor maimed in the common enterprise received a settled compensation for the loss of a limb or an eye. Decisions of importance were often put to the vote of the whole company, and the captain's absolute authority extended only to the moments of chase and battle, when a single will was needed. It was, in its strange way, one of the more democratic institutions of an undemocratic age, a floating commonwealth of outlaws, in which men who had been treated as little better than beasts of burden in the legitimate world governed themselves as equals and shared the fruits of their labor by agreement rather than by the will of a master. This was no small part of the appeal that drew men to the pirate's life, the promise not merely of riches, but of a rough dignity and a share in the governing of their own affairs. And it helps to explain the fierce loyalty that bound such crews together, and the willingness with which they followed a trusted captain, like every, into ventures that might well end them all. And yet, for all the fellowship and the rough justice of their internal order, the men of the Fancy were bound together above all by the knowledge that they had placed themselves beyond every law and every mercy save their own, that the world outside their little wooden commonwealth regarded them as enemies to be hunted and destroyed, and that their only security lay in their solidarity, their skill, and the speed of their ship. This knowledge gave their fellowship a hard edge, a desperate quality beneath the surface of the shared songs and the divided plunder. For every man aboard understood that a single betrayal, a single moment of weakness or bad fortune, might deliver them all to the rope. They were free, in a sense that few men of their age were free, and they were doomed, in a way that few men were doomed. And they lived in the narrow space between the freedom and the doom with a mixture of recklessness and grim solidarity that was the true spirit of the pirate life, far from the gaudy legend, but closer, perhaps, to something genuinely and tragically human. It was here, in the pirate havens of the Indian Ocean, that the shape of every's great design came into focus. The rovers of that sea had long understood that the richest prizes of all were not the European merchantmen, which were well armed and carried cargoes of no more than ordinary value, but the great ships of the Indian and Arab trades, and above all the ships of the annual pilgrimage. Each year, from the ports of the Mughal Empire, a fleet of vessels set out, carrying pilgrims to the holy city of Mecca and to the great trading port of Mocha at the mouth of the Red Sea. And each year that fleet returned, laden not only with pilgrims, but with the accumulated wealth of a season's trade, gold and silver and jewels and fine goods, the treasure of an empire whose riches dwarfed anything in Europe. These pilgrim ships were enormous, far larger than the Fancy, and they carried guns and men enough to defend themselves in theory. But in practice, they were poorly handled, their gunners untrained, their crews unprepared for a determined assault. For no one in living memory had dared to attack the grand fleet of the Mughal emperor, and the ships that carried it had grown complacent in the long security of their unchallenged passage. To the pirates of the Indian Ocean, this fleet was the ultimate prize, a river of treasure that passed within reach once a year, guarded by ships that looked formidable but had never truly been tested. Every meant to test them. The Mughal Empire, whose wealth every now set his sights upon, was in those years perhaps the richest and most powerful state on earth, a vast dominion covering most of the Indian subcontinent, ruled by the Emperor Aurangzeb from a court of legendary splendor. Its cities were among the greatest in the world. Its craftsmen produced textiles and jewelry of a quality Europe could not match, and its treasury overflowed with the accumulated wealth of centuries of trade and conquest. To the merchants of the English East India Company, the Mughal Empire was not a place to be conquered or defied, but a power to be courted, flattered, and carefully obeyed. For the company's whole profitable presence in India rested upon the goodwill of the emperor and his officials, who could, with a word, close the ports and warehouses on which English trade depended. This delicate arrangement, in which a handful of European merchants operated on sufferance within the domains of a mighty Asian empire, was the true political reality of the Indian Ocean in the 1690s, and it is essential to understanding the storm that every was about to unleash. For when a European pirate attacked the emperor's own ships, the emperor would not distinguish nicely between pirates and merchants, between outlaws and the honest servants of the company. He would see only that Europeans had assaulted his fleet and dishonored his pilgrims, and his anger would fall upon every European within his reach. Every, of course, can't have grasped the full scale of the consequences his design would set in motion. The diplomatic crisis, the threat to the whole English position in India, the first coordinated manhunt in the history of the world. He was a pirate captain seeking the greatest prize on the sea, and he thought, as such men did, in terms of the immediate haul, the treasure that might be taken and shared and carried away before any pursuit could form. But even at the level of the immediate venture, the plan he now set about arranging was a bold one, for the pilgrim fleet was strong enough that no single pirate ship could hope to take it. What was needed was a combination, a temporary fleet of rovers gathered together for this one great enterprise, several ships acting in concert to overwhelm the defenses of the treasure vessels. And so, in the pirate havens of the Indian Ocean, every set about assembling his fleet, drawing to his design the other rovers of those waters, men who shared his hunger for the great prize, and who recognized in the Fancy and her captain the natural leaders of such a venture. One by one the ships came in, small vessels for the most part, sloops and lightly armed craft, carrying crews of desperate and greedy men, until every had gathered a squadron of several ships under a loose common command, all bound for a single rendezvous at the mouth of the Red Sea, where the pilgrim fleet would have to pass on its way home to Surat, and where they meant to be waiting. The place they chose for their ambush was the strait known as the Bab el Mandeb, the narrow gateway between the Red Sea and the wider ocean, through which every ship of the Pilgrim fleet would have to pass on its homeward voyage. It was a natural point of interception, a bottleneck where the treasure of an empire would be funneled into a channel, narrow enough that a waiting fleet might hope to catch it. There the pirates gathered, and there they settled down to wait, watching the horizon for the sails of the great ships, their whole fortune riding on the chance that the fleet would pass within their reach and that they would prove strong enough to take it. It was a patient game, and patience, of all the pirate virtues, was the one Henry Every possessed in the greatest measure. He had waited out the long, ruinous months in the harbour of the Groyne. He had waited through the long passage around Africa. Now he waited at the gate of the Red Sea for the richest prize in the world to come to him. And while he waited, far to the north in the ports of the Mughal Empire, that prize was being loaded aboard the great ships and made ready for the voyage that would carry it, all unknowing, straight into the waiting guns of the Fancy and her consorts. The days of waiting at the mouth of the Red Sea stretched long and hot, and for the men of the gathered pirate fleet, they were days of mounting tension held in check by the enforced idleness of the ambush. A pirate's life, for all its reputation, consisted mostly of waiting, of long, empty stretches on a wide and featureless sea, broken only rarely by the sudden urgency of a chase. Now the waiting had a knife's edge to it, for every man aboard the ships understood that the prize they hoped for was the greatest any of them had ever pursued, and that its coming was a matter of chance and timing over which they had no control. They watched the northern horizon, where the strait narrowed toward the Red Sea, and they scanned the empty water for the first pale hint of a distant sail. And the sun rose and crossed and set, and still the fleet did not come. Food and water grew short, tempers frayed in the heat, and beneath it all lay the gnawing fear that they had miscalculated, that the Pilgrim fleet had already passed, or would take some other route, or would come so strongly guarded that even their gathered squadron could not hope to take it. The Pilgrim fleet they awaited was a thing of genuine magnificence, and it is worth pausing to see it clearly, for its scale explains both the boldness of the pirates' design and the fury that its capture would provoke. Each year, the ships of the Mughal Empire carried the faithful on the long voyage to Mecca, the holy pilgrimage that every believer who could manage it hoped once in life to make, and the fleet that bore them was a floating expression of the empire's wealth and piety. The greatest of the ships were vast, towering vessels, far larger than any European merchantman, carrying hundreds of passengers and crew, and laden on the return voyage with the profits of a season's trade in the markets of Arabia. For the pilgrimage was also a great commercial occasion, and the ships that carried pilgrims carried also merchants and their goods, and returned heavy with gold and silver coin, with jewels and precious wares, with all the accumulated wealth of an empire's most prosperous trade. The grandest of all the ships in that year's fleet was a great vessel belonging to the emperor himself, an enormous ship that the English called the Gunsway, a corruption of her true name, the Ganj-i-Sawai, which meant something like the exceeding treasure, and she carried, along with hundreds of pilgrims and a fortune in coin and jewels, some of the most important personages of the empire, returning from their devotions to the court at Surat. For a fleet of small pirate ships to contemplate attacking such a vessel was, on the face of it, an act bordering on madness. The Ganj-i-Sawai carried many guns and hundreds of armed men, more than enough on paper to beat off any assault the ragged pirate squadron could mount. But paper strength and real strength are different things, and that shrewd reader of ships and men, had understood the difference. The great pilgrim ships were strong in the way that a fortress with a sleeping garrison is strong, formidable in appearance but unprepared in practice. Their gunners inexperienced, their crews unaccustomed to serious battle, their whole manner grown complacent in the long decades during which no one had dared to trouble them. Against such a defense, a smaller but determined and battle-ready force might well prevail, if fortune favored it, and if the first blow could be made to tell. This was the gamble on which the pirates had staked everything, and now, at the gate of the Red Sea, they waited to see whether the gamble would pay. And then, one night, the fleet came and slipped through their fingers. In the darkness, with the pirate ships lying in wait, the great convoy of the Pilgrim fleet passed by the mouth of the strait, and by some combination of ill luck and the difficulty of watching a wide channel in the dark, the pirates failed to intercept the main body of it. The ships they had waited so long to catch went past them in the night, running for home with their treasure, and by the time the pirates understood what had happened, the fleet was ahead of them and drawing away toward the safety of the Indian coast. It was the kind of moment that decides the fate of ventures, the near miss that turns triumph into failure, and a lesser commander, or a less determined crew, might have given the whole thing up as lost. The prize had passed. The long wait had come to nothing. The fleet was ahead and running, and to catch it now would mean a hard chase across open water with no certainty of success at the end of it. But Henry Every did not give up, and neither did the boldest of his consorts. The chase was on. The pirate ships crowded on all the sail they could carry and set off in pursuit of the vanished fleet. And here the long labor Every had put into making the Fancy fast began to repay itself, for she was among the swiftest ships in those waters, and she began to overhaul the slower vessels of the convoy. Not all the pirate ships could keep the pace. The smaller and slower craft fell behind, and the squadron that had gathered so carefully at the mouth of the Red Sea began to string out across the sea, the fastest hulls drawing ahead in the pursuit while the laggards struggled to keep up. It became, in effect, a race, the swift ships of the pirates chasing the heavy ships of the Pilgrim fleet across the open water, and the outcome would depend on speed and endurance, and the willingness of the pursuers to press the chase to its very limit. The Fancy pressed it. Day and night she ran on, her captain driving her hard, the great prize somewhere ahead beyond the curve of the sea, and slowly, hour by hour, the gap began to close. It is a strange thing to consider, across the distance of the centuries, how much turned upon that chase, how the whole weight of what was to follow, the diplomatic crisis, the manhunt, the shaking of the English position in India, hung upon the simple question of whether one fast ship could overhaul a slower one across a stretch of empty ocean. Had the Fancy been slower, or the chase abandoned, Henry Every would be at most a footnote in the history of piracy, a mutineer who took a ship and gathered a fleet and came home empty-handed, forgotten within a generation. Instead, the Fancy ran on, gaining, and ahead of her, the great ships of the Pilgrim fleet grew slowly larger on the horizon, and the moment approached, still some way off but coming now, with the certainty of a thing that cannot be stopped, when the pirates would come up with their prey, and the long patient design would resolve itself, at last, into the thunder of the guns. First, though, there was a smaller ship to be dealt with, a straggler of the fleet that the pirates would come up with before they reached the great prize. And in the taking of that lesser vessel, the pirates would find both a foretaste of the treasure that awaited them and the encouragement they needed to press on toward the greatest ship of all. The first of the great Pilgrim ships to fall into the pirates' hands was a vessel the English called the Fateh Muhammad, a substantial ship of the fleet that the Fancy overhauled after the long chase. She was no small prize in herself, a large trading vessel carrying a considerable cargo, and under other circumstances, her capture would have been the crowning achievement of a pirate's career. Yet the manner of her taking told every much about what lay ahead, for the Fateh Muhammad, for all her size, put up little real resistance. Whether her crew was disheartened by the sight of the pirate ships bearing down upon them, or simply unready for a fight, the great vessel was taken without the desperate struggle that her guns and her numbers might have promised. The pirates swarmed aboard, secured the ship, and set about the work of plunder, and what they found confirmed everything they had hoped. The Fateh Muhammad carried treasure in gold and silver, a sum that by the standards of ordinary piracy was a fortune, enough to make every man in the pirate fleet wealthy beyond his former dreams. And yet this rich prize was only the smaller of the two great ships, the straggler, the lesser vessel that the pirates had come up with first. Somewhere ahead still ran the greatest ship of all, the emperor's own treasure vessel, the Ganj-i-Sawai, and the ease with which the Fateh Muhammad had fallen gave the pirates the heart to pursue her. The plunder of the Fateh Muhammad did more than fill the pirates' holds. It sharpened their appetite and steadied their resolve. Men who had waited long and chased hard and begun to doubt now held actual gold in their hands. The proof that the great design was no fantasy, but a thing that could be done, and the taste of it drove them on. Every gathered what strength remained to him, the ships that had kept the pace of the chase and pressed on after the greater prize. The pilgrim fleet had scattered under the pressure of the pursuit, its ships running each for its own safety, and the Ganj-i-Sawai, for all her size, was now alone upon the sea, without the protection of the fleet, a single great vessel with a single great treasure aboard her, and the pirates closing steadily from astern. The stage was set for the encounter that would make Henry Every's name, the moment toward which the whole long story had been building since the night the Charles II changed hands in the harbour of the Groyne. The Ganj-i-Sawai was a formidable ship, and the fight for her, when it came, was not the easy affair that the taking of the Fateh Muhammad had been. She carried a heavy armament and a large crew, and her commander, unlike the master of the straggler, meant to defend her. As the pirates came up, the great ship opened fire, and for a time the outcome hung genuinely in the balance. For the Ganj-i-Sawai was strong enough that a lucky blow or a determined defense might have driven the pirates off or crippled the fancy and ended the whole venture in ruin. What decided the matter was a stroke of the pure chance that so often turns the course of battles. Early in the engagement, one of the great ship's own cannon burst as it was fired, a catastrophic failure of the sort that could happen to any gun of that age when it was overcharged or flawed in its casting, and the bursting of the gun killed and injured men on the Ganj-i-Sawai's own deck and threw her defenders into confusion. In nearly the same moment, a shot from the pirates brought down part of the great ship's rigging, wounding her ability to maneuver. These two blows, the one self-inflicted and the other from the pirates' guns, fell close together, and between them they broke the balance of the fight. The confusion aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai spread, her defense faltered, and the pirates seized their moment to close and board. The boarding of the Ganj-i-Sawai was the hinge of the whole affair, the instant at which the greatest treasure ship on the sea passed into the hands of a few hundred desperate men. And it was, by every account, a hard and grievous business. The defenders, though disordered, were numerous, and the fight upon the decks of the great ship went on for a considerable time, close and confused and costly, as such fights always were. The pirates, fewer in number, but fierce with the prospect of the fortune before them and the knowledge that they had no line of retreat, pressed their assault with a determination that the ship's defenders, disheartened by the bursting of their gun and the loss of their commander's firm hand, could not in the end withstand. Accounts differ, as they always do, on the details of who fought bravely and who gave way, on the conduct of the ship's commander, on the exact course of the struggle. But the outcome was not in doubt once the pirates had gained the deck in force. The resistance of the Ganj-i-Sawai crumbled, and the great ship, the emperor's own vessel, the exceeding treasure, fell into the hands of Henry Every and his crew, the richest single prize ever taken by a pirate ship on the open sea. What followed the fall of the ship belongs to the darker part of this story, and it must be told plainly, without either the false comfort of omission or the false excitement of dwelling upon horror. The pirates had taken a ship carrying not only treasure but hundreds of people, pilgrims returning from the holiest journey of their faith. Among them, women and men of high rank in the Mughal Empire. Over the days that the pirates held the ship, grievous wrongs were done to these captives, cruelties that darkened the whole affair and that no honest telling can pass over. The men who had turned pirate out of grievance and desperation, who had suffered real wrongs of their own at the hands of a system that cheated them, now inflicted far worse wrongs upon people who had done them no harm. And the suffering that took place aboard the Ganji Sawai in those days was severe and left a stain upon the whole enterprise that no amount of treasure could wash away. This is the hard truth at the center of the legend, the truth that the ballads and the romances always soften or ignore. The greatest heist in the history of the sea was also an act of great cruelty against innocent people, and Henry Every, whatever his gifts of leadership and cunning, presided over it and bears the weight of it. The story is worth telling for what it reveals about its age and about the thin line between grievance and wrongdoing. But it is not a story of gallant rogues, and it should not be dressed up as one. When at last the pirates had finished their work aboard the great ship, they had taken a treasure whose sheer scale is difficult to grasp even now. The gold and silver coin alone was reckoned in the hundreds of thousands of pounds, an almost unimaginable sum for the age, and to it were added jewels and precious wares of enormous value. The accumulated wealth of the empire's richest trade and the personal riches of the great personages aboard. Shared out among the few hundred men of the pirate fleet, it made each of them wealthy beyond anything a common seaman could ordinarily hope to see in a dozen lifetimes. The exact figures will never be known with certainty, for pirates kept no honest accounts, and the tales grew in the telling. But by any reckoning, the haul was the greatest ever taken by such means, a fortune so large that its very size would become part of the problem. For a treasure of that magnitude could not be quietly spent, and the men who carried it would find themselves marked by it, hunted for it, and in the end, many of them destroyed by it. For the moment, though, they had done the impossible thing. They had taken the emperor's treasure ship, and they turned now to the business of dividing the spoils and making their escape. All unaware of the storm their deed was about to raise in the halls of power from Delhi to London, a storm that would make Henry Every the most hunted man on earth. The division of the spoils was, in the strange order of the pirate world, a matter conducted with a certain rough fairness, for the whole compact that held such crews together rested upon the understanding that every man would receive his agreed share of whatever was taken. The treasure of the Ganji Sawai and the Fateh Muhammad was gathered and counted, or counted as well as such a haul could be, and divided among the men of the fleet according to the articles they had agreed upon before the venture. Each common seaman received a share that made him, by the standards of his former life, immensely rich, a sum that a sailor might labor a lifetime and never see, now placed in his hands in a single stroke. The officers and the captain took larger portions, as was the custom, and there were shares set aside for the ships themselves and for the men who had been injured, according to the pirate code that provided compensation for wounds suffered in the common enterprise. It was a peculiar spectacle, this careful and almost business-like division of a stolen fortune among men who had just committed one of the great crimes of the age. But it was entirely characteristic of the pirate world, which combined lawlessness toward the outside with a strict internal order, a rough equality, and a keen sense of fair dealing among the members of the band. A pirate crew that cheated its own men did not last, for the men would not stand for it, and so the division of the plunder was watched jealously and conducted openly, and every man knew what he had coming and saw that he received it. With the treasure divided, the fleet that had gathered for the great venture began to break apart, its purpose accomplished, its members each wishing to carry his new fortune to safety by his own road. This scattering was itself a matter of prudence, for a fleet of pirate ships was far more likely to draw pursuit and attention than a single vessel slipping quietly away. And the men understood that their best hope of enjoying their riches lay in dispersing, in becoming again ordinary and unremarkable, in melting back into the vast anonymity of the sea from which they had briefly and spectacularly emerged. Every aboard the Fancy set his own course, and it was a course that showed once again the shrewdness that marked his whole career. He did not linger in the Indian Ocean, where the outrage of the capture would soon make those waters far too dangerous, and where the ships of the East India Company and the vengeful power of the Mughal Empire would soon be searching for the men who had done this thing. Instead, he turned the Fancy westward and southward, back around the great shoulder of Africa, and set his course across the Atlantic toward the islands of the Caribbean, and specifically toward the Bahamas, where he believed correctly that a man with enough gold might buy himself safety and a fresh beginning. The voyage away from the scene of the crime was long, and it gave the men aboard the Fancy time to consider what they had done and what it might mean. They were rich now, richer than they had ever imagined, but they were also marked men, and the more thoughtful among them must have understood that the very size of their fortune had made them a target. A man who returns to England with a modest sum might slip back into ordinary life unnoticed. But a man who returns with a share of the greatest pirate haul in history carries his guilt in his very wealth, for the sudden and unexplained riches of a common sailor would draw suspicion wherever he tried to spend them. This was the trap that closed slowly around Every's men, the paradox at the heart of their triumph, that the treasure which had been the whole object of the venture was also the thing that would betray them, the mark of the criminal that could not be washed away or hidden, the evidence that walked with them wherever they went. Some of them understood this and acted with caution. Others did not, and their carelessness would help to bring the manhunt down upon them all. As the Fancy made her way across the ocean, the news of what she had done was already racing ahead of her by other channels, spreading through the ports and courts of the world with a speed that, for that age, was remarkable, driven by the enormity of the deed and the fury of those it had wronged. In the Mughal port of Surat, where the plundered ships had been bound, the return of the survivors with their account of the assault set off an explosion of outrage that shook the whole delicate structure of European trade in India. The Emperor Aurangzeb, when word reached his court, was possessed by a cold and towering anger, for the ships that had been taken were his own. The treasure was his and his subjects, and among the captives who had suffered so grievously were persons of high rank whose mistreatment was an affront to the honor of the empire itself. That European pirates had dared to do this thing was, to the Mughal court, an intolerable insult, and the emperor's anger fell, as Every could never have intended but might have foreseen, not upon the pirates alone who were beyond his reach, but upon the Europeans who were within it, the merchants of the trading companies whose factories and warehouses stood in the emperor's ports and depended entirely upon his goodwill. The English East India Company, in particular, found itself in a position of the gravest peril, for the pirates who had committed the outrage were, most of them, Englishmen, and the Mughal authorities made little distinction between one sort of Englishman and another. To the officials of the emperor, the company that traded in their ports and the pirates who plundered their ships were both simply Europeans, and if the pirates could not be punished, then the company would answer for them. The English factories at Surat and elsewhere were seized, their officials imprisoned, their trade halted, and for a time it seemed possible that the whole English presence in India, built up over decades of careful diplomacy and enormous investment, might be swept away entirely in the storm of the emperor's wrath. The men who ran the company, comfortable merchants in London and anxious factors in India, found their fortunes and their very lives threatened by the actions of a pirate they had never met and could not control. And they understood at once that the crisis could be resolved only by demonstrating to the emperor that the English themselves would hunt down and punish the men responsible. And so the machinery of retribution began to turn, driven not by simple justice, but by the desperate need of the company to save its trade. And the object toward which all that machinery was directed was the man aboard the Fancy, running westward across the Atlantic with a fortune in his hold, Henry Every, who had wanted only to be rich and had made himself, instead, the most wanted man in the world. It is one of the quiet ironies of the story that Every himself, sailing across the empty ocean toward the Bahamas, cannot have grasped the full scale of what he had set in motion. He knew he had taken a great prize and that there would be pursuit, but the whole vast apparatus of consequence, the seizure of the company's factories, the imperial fury, the diplomatic crisis, the unprecedented manhunt that was even then being organized, unfolded far behind him and largely beyond his knowledge. He was a pirate captain who had pulled off the greatest robbery of the age and was now concerned, sensibly enough, with getting himself and his men and his treasure to a place of safety. That his single act of theft had shaken an empire and imperiled the whole English enterprise in the East was a truth that belonged to a scale of history far above the deck of the Fancy. And it is only from the distance of the centuries that we can see the full pattern of it. The way one desperate deed by one obscure and disappointed sailor rippled outward across the whole trading world and left its mark upon the fortunes of nations. To that widening storm of consequence, and to the extraordinary hunt it set in motion, the story must now turn, for the taking of the treasure was only the middle of the tale, and the strangest part, the part that made Henry. Every not merely a rich pirate but a legend, was the part in which he vanished from the earth entirely and was never seen again. The hunt for Henry. Every was, in a real sense, the first of its kind. A manhunt conducted not within the borders of a single country, but across the whole of the known world, coordinated between governments and companies and colonial authorities on several continents, all directed toward the capture of a single man and his crew. Nothing quite like it had been attempted before, and its scale was a measure of the enormity of what Every had done, and of the desperation of those whose interests he had endangered. The English East India Company, whose whole eastern trade hung in the balance, threw itself into the pursuit with the energy of men fighting for their survival, offering a reward for the capture of the pirates that was, for its day, an enormous sum, and pressing the government to add its own weight to the hunt. The Crown, understanding that the stability of English trade and the honor of the nation were at stake, issued proclamations declaring Every and his men pirates and enemies of all mankind, to be seized wherever they might be found, and these proclamations, printed and carried by ship to every English port and colony across the world, spread the description of the wanted men from the Caribbean to the coasts of India, a net of paper cast across the oceans in the hope of catching men who had made their whole art the business of not being caught. The reward offered for Every's capture grew until it was one of the largest bounties ever placed upon a man's head, swollen by the contributions of the company and the Crown, and the sheer determination of those who wished to see the affair resolved. To the enormous sum offered by the English authorities, the East India Company added its own reward, and the combined bounty made the taking of Henry Every a prize worth pursuing for its own sake, quite apart from any question of justice. Word of the reward travelled with the proclamations, and across the trading world, men who had never heard of Henry Every a year before now knew his name and his description, and the fortune that awaited whoever could bring him in. It was, in effect, the invention of a new kind of fame, the fame of the wanted man, the notoriety that attaches to the fugitive whose face, or at least whose name and reputation, becomes known to a whole world that is united in the effort to catch him. Every had wanted to be rich. He had made himself, instead, famous in the most dangerous way a man can be famous, and the very reach of his fame was now the greatest threat to his survival. Yet for all the unprecedented scale of the hunt, it labored under a difficulty that would prove, in every own case, decisive. And that difficulty was the sheer size of the world and the slowness with which anything moved across it. A proclamation might be carried to every port, but it moved at the pace of a sailing ship, taking months to reach the far corners of the earth. And by the time it arrived, the man it described might be 1,000 miles away under another name. A description of a wanted pirate was of limited use when there were no photographs, no reliable portraits, no means of identifying a man except by the word of those who had known him. And a sailor of ordinary appearance, with his fortune converted quietly into a form that could be spent without arousing suspicion, might pass through the very ports where his name was cried without anyone the wiser. The hunt for Every, for all its energy and its unprecedented reach, was in the end a hunt conducted largely in the dark, groping after a man who had every advantage that anonymity and distance and the slowness of the age could confer. It caught in time a number of his men, the careless and the unlucky, but the man himself it never touched. And this failure, this great and famous failure of the whole vast apparatus of pursuit, is the very thing that raised Henry Every from a successful pirate into a legend. The East India Company's role in the hunt deserves a closer look, for it reveals much about the strange politics of the affair. The company was not a government, but it acted like one, maintaining its own ships and forts and armed men, and conducting its own diplomacy with the powers of the East. And in the crisis brought on by Every's deed, it found itself forced to become, in effect, the police of the seas, hunting down the pirate, not out of any love of justice, but to save its own trade and its own people. From the wrath of the Mughal emperor, the company's officials in India had been imprisoned and its factories seized, and the only way to secure their release and the resumption of trade was to convince the emperor that the English were doing everything in their power to punish the men responsible. And so the company poured money and effort into the hunt, and pressed the government at home to do the same, and made the capture of Every and his men a matter of the highest priority. Not because it cared greatly about the crime in itself, but because its whole profitable existence depended upon being seen to care. There is a hard lesson in this about the way the world works, about how the pursuit of justice is so often driven by interest rather than by principle, and about how a great commercial power, threatened in its profits, will move heaven and earth to accomplish what it would never have troubled to do for the sake of right alone. The proclamations and the bounty and the whole machinery of the hunt had one effect that Every may not have foreseen, which was to fix his name and his deed permanently in the public imagination, to make him, in the very act of hunting him, into a figure of fascination and even of a kind of admiration. For there is in the human heart a stubborn sympathy for the fugitive, for the man who has done a great and daring thing and slipped away from all the powers arrayed against him. And as the months passed and the hunt failed and Every remained uncaught, that sympathy began to gather around his name. The pirate who had robbed an empire and vanished became, in the ballads and the tavern talk of England, a kind of folk hero, his crimes forgotten or forgiven, his daring celebrated, his escape cheered by ordinary people who felt, however dimly, that in cheating the great powers of the world, he had somehow struck a blow on their behalf. This was, of course, a sentimental distortion of the truth, which ignored the real cruelty of what had been done aboard the treasure ship. But it was a powerful and enduring one, and it is the reason that Henry Every is remembered today not with the disgust his actions might warrant, but with a kind of rueful fascination, as the pirate who pulled off the impossible and got clean away. While the hunt spread its net across the world, and the legend began to grow in the taverns of England, the object of it all was making his way toward the one place where he thought he might find safety, the pirate-friendly islands of the Bahamas, where the reach of the law was weak and the local governor was a man who might, for a sufficient consideration, be persuaded to look the other way. It was here, in the shabby and half-lawless world of the Caribbean colonies, that every would make his final recorded appearance in the light of history, and here that he would take the decisive steps that allowed him to vanish. The story of his disappearance is a story of gold changing hands in the offices of corruptible officials, of a crew scattering to the four winds, of a ship abandoned and a captain melting away into the anonymous crowd of the seafaring world. It is a story, in the end, of a man who understood that the surest way to escape the greatest manhunt in history was simply to cease to exist, to shed his name and his ship and his fame, and become again what he had been at the beginning, an ordinary and unremarkable man of whom the world took no notice. To that final act of vanishing, the strangest and most enduring part of the whole strange tale, the story now comes at last. The fancy came at last to the Bahamas, to the island of New Providence and its harbour, in the spring of the year following the great capture, and there Henry Every set about the delicate business of turning his triumph into a permanent escape. The Bahamas in those days were a poor and half-governed cluster of islands on the edge of the English colonial world, a place where the authority of the crown was thin, and the men who held office were often more interested in their own enrichment than in the enforcement of the law. The governor of the islands was a man named Trott, and to him Every made his approach, not as a wanted pirate throwing himself upon the mercy of the authorities, but as a wealthy shipmaster offering a handsome gift in exchange for a friendly reception and no awkward questions. The gift he offered was substantial, a share of the treasure and, by some accounts, the fancy herself. A fine ship worth a great deal to a colonial governor who could always find a use for such a vessel. And in return, Every and his men were permitted to come ashore, to disperse, and to go about their business unmolested, at least for a time. Whether Trott knew the full truth of who his visitors were, or chose not to know it, or simply calculated that the gold in his hand was worth more than the risk of harbouring fugitives, the effect was the same. The greatest pirate in the world was allowed to land his men and his treasure in an English colony and to melt quietly away, his passage smoothed by the oldest lubricant in the world, which is money placed discreetly in the right hands. It is worth dwelling for a moment on this episode, for it shows with particular clarity the theme that runs through Every's whole story, the theme of the thinness of the line between the outlaw and the respectable, between the criminal and the servant of the law. Here was a colonial governor, an official of the English crown, accepting a fortune in stolen treasure from the most wanted man in the world, and allowing him to escape, and doing so not in some dramatic act of villainy, but in the ordinary, everyday manner of a small official making a comfortable arrangement for his own benefit. The corruption was casual, almost routine, the kind of thing that oiled the workings of the whole colonial world. And it reminds us that the pursuit of Every, for all its high proclamations about justice and the honor of the nation, took place in a world where a great many respectable men were perfectly willing to profit from crime so long as they could do so quietly. Every understood this world perfectly, and he used it. He knew that a man with enough gold could buy his way past almost any obstacle, that the law was a good deal more flexible in practice than in principle, and that the surest guarantee of a governor's friendship was a share in the spoils. It was a cynical understanding, but it was an accurate one, and it served him well at the most dangerous moment of his life. Once ashore and safe, at least for the moment, the crew of the Fancy began to scatter, and this scattering was the beginning of the end for many of them, even as it was the salvation of a few. The men who had shared in the great treasure now went their separate ways, some remaining in the Caribbean, some taking ship for the American colonies, some setting out to return to England or Ireland, each carrying his share of the fortune and his share of the danger, for the treasure that made them rich also marked them, and the more careless among them, the men who could not resist displaying their sudden wealth or who spoke too freely of where it had come from, began to draw the attention of the authorities who were, even in the distant colonies, on the watch for Every's men. Some were arrested in the American colonies, where the colonial governors, unlike the accommodating Trott, were eager to prove their diligence by catching a few of the notorious pirates. Others were taken in England and Ireland when they returned home, and their sudden riches gave them away. The great manhunt, which could not lay hands on Every himself, began to close, instead, upon his followers. The small fish caught in the net while the great ones slipped through, and one by one, a number of the crew of the Fancy passed from the freedom their fortune had brought them into the custody of the law that their fortune had betrayed them to. The pattern of these arrests tells its own quiet story about the difficulty of enjoying ill-gotten wealth. A share of the treasure of the Ganges Sawai was enough to make a common sailor rich for life, but only if he could spend it without arousing suspicion, and this proved harder than many of the men had imagined. A sailor who suddenly appeared in his home village with a fortune in gold, who bought land or lived in a style far above his former station, invited exactly the questions that a wanted pirate could not afford to answer, and the very wealth that was the whole object of the venture became the thread by which the law traced its way back to the men who had taken it. Some managed to hide their riches, to spend cautiously, to invent plausible stories about the source of their money, and these escaped. Others could not resist the temptation to enjoy their new wealth openly, and these were caught. It was a cruel lesson in the nature of the fortune they had won, that a treasure too large to hide was a treasure that could not be safely spent, and that the men who had risked everything to become rich found that their riches had made them prisoners of a different kind, marked and hunted and unable ever to rest. Through all of this, Henry Every himself remained free, and more than free, he remained invisible. For from the moment he left the Bahamas, he passes almost entirely out of the reliable record of history. It is known, or strongly believed, that he made his way from the Caribbean back across the Atlantic toward the British Isles, that he landed, perhaps in Ireland, perhaps elsewhere, and that he then set about the business of converting his treasure into a form that could be safely held and spent, and of disappearing into the ordinary life of an anonymous man. Beyond that, the record fails, and the man who had been the most wanted in the world simply ceases to appear in the documents that might have tracked him. There are hints and rumors, a possible sighting here, a suggestive name in a register there, but nothing certain, nothing that allows us to follow him to his end with any confidence. He shed his identity as a snake sheds its skin, becoming Bridgman or some other name, dispersing his treasure through the hands of merchants he hoped he could trust, and stepping out of the light of history into a shadow from which he never emerged. It was the final and greatest act of his career, this act of vanishing, and it was, in its way, more remarkable than the taking of the treasure itself. For many pirates took great prizes, but almost none of them managed to escape the consequences so completely that history could never afterward say for certain what had become of them. The scattering of the crew and the vanishing of the captain left the authorities in a difficult position. For the great manhunt had been proclaimed to the world. The honor of the nation and the survival of the East India Company's trade demanded that justice be seen to be done, and yet the chief author of the crime had slipped entirely beyond reach. What could be done, and what was done, was to make an example of those of the crew who had been caught, to bring them to trial and to punishment, so that the world, and above all the Mughal emperor, might see that the English took the matter seriously and would not shelter such men. And so, even as Henry Every faded into anonymity somewhere in the British Isles, a number of his former shipmates were brought before the courts in England to answer for the deeds of the Fancy. and their trials, which were watched with the keenest interest by all the interested parties, form the last public act of the whole drama, the point at which the law, having failed to catch the man it most wanted, turned its full weight upon those it could reach. To that final act of the story, the trials and their strange and revealing course, the tale now turns. The trials of the captured members of Evry's crew took place in London, and they proved to be a far more troublesome affair for the authorities than anyone had anticipated. For the law, when it was finally brought to bear, did not behave as those who wielded it had expected. The government and the East India Company had every reason to want a swift and certain conviction. For the whole point of the trials was to demonstrate to the world, and above all to the Mughal emperor, that England would punish the men who had committed the outrage, and an acquittal would have been a diplomatic catastrophe, a signal to the emperor that the English either could not or would not bring their pirates to justice. And yet, when the first group of prisoners was brought to trial on the charge of piracy, the jury, hearing the case, declined to convict them. It was an outcome that stunned the authorities and threatened to unravel the whole careful effort to appease the emperor. And it revealed something important about how the ordinary people of England felt toward the men who had robbed the treasure ship. The jurors, drawn from the common folk of London, seemed to have shared in the widespread sympathy for the pirates. That stubborn admiration for the daring men who had struck at the great and distant powers of the world, and got away with a fortune, and they were reluctant to send such men to the gallows. The acquittal threw the government into consternation, for it could not be allowed to stand, and the authorities set about finding a way to try the men again on different grounds. This second time, the prisoners were charged not merely with piracy, but with the mutiny by which they had seized the Charles II in the harbour of the Groyne, the original crime from which all the rest had flowed. And on this charge, which touched upon the sacred principle of obedience aboard ship and the property rights of the vessel's owners, the courts were determined to secure a conviction. The retrial was managed with a firmer hand, the jury more carefully guided toward the outcome the authorities required. And this time, the verdict went as the government wished. A number of the men were found guilty and condemned to death, and the sentences were carried out in the customary manner reserved for pirates, at the place on the bank of the river where such executions were held, below the high water mark, in token of the sea's jurisdiction over the crimes committed upon it. There the condemned men met their end, hanged for the deeds of the fancy, and their bodies were left, as was the grim custom, hanging in chains as a warning to other seamen who might be tempted to follow the same road. There is a bitter and revealing irony in the fact that the men were, in the end, convicted and hanged, not so much for the great crime of robbing the treasure ship, for which the first jury had refused to condemn them, but for the earlier crime of mutiny against their own captain and the theft of their employer's ship. It was as though the law, unable to punish them for the deed that had truly outraged the world, fell back upon the older and more fundamental offence, the breaking of the compact of obedience that held the whole maritime order together. To the merchants and ship owners who ruled that world, the mutiny was in some sense the graver crime, for it struck at the very foundation of their power, the assumption that a crew would obey its officers and that a ship belonged to those who had paid for it. The robbing of a distant emperor's treasure ship was a spectacular and troublesome thing, but the seizing of an English ship by its own English crew was an attack upon the whole system of authority and property on which the maritime world was built. And it was for this, in the final reckoning, that the men of the fancy died. The number who suffered this fate was small, a handful of the many who had sailed with Evry and shared in the treasure, and the smallness of the number is itself a comment upon the whole affair. The great manhunt, proclaimed to the world and pursued across continents, caught in the end only a few of the least careful and least fortunate of the crew. And even these were convicted only with difficulty and by a certain manipulation of the charges against them. The overwhelming majority of the men who had taken the treasure of the Ganges Sawai were never caught at all, but slipped away with their shares into the anonymity of the seafaring world, to spend their fortunes, or lose them, or drink them away, in ports and villages scattered across 2 hemispheres, their names unrecorded, their fates unknown. And the man who had led them all, the captain who had planned and commanded the whole venture, was not among the condemned, for he had vanished, and no amount of proclamation or reward or diligent pursuit had been able to lay hands upon him. The trials, for all the solemnity with which they were conducted and the diplomatic weight that rested upon them, were in truth a hollow triumph, a punishment of the few that could not disguise the escape of the many and the complete disappearance of the one who mattered most. For the East India Company, the trials and the executions served their purpose well enough, for they allowed the company to demonstrate to the Mughal authorities that the English had indeed hunted down and punished at least some of the guilty men. And this demonstration, together with promises of compensation and improved protection for the pilgrim ships in future, helped in time to soothe the emperor's anger and to secure the release of the imprisoned company officials and the resumption of the vital trade. The crisis that Evry's deed had provoked, which at its height had threatened the whole English position in India, was gradually contained and resolved, though not without lasting damage and a lasting lesson about the vulnerability of the European traders who operated on sufferance within the domains of a great Asian empire. The company learned that it could not afford to be associated with piracy, that the actions of a few outlaws could imperil the fortunes of the whole enterprise, and it became, in the years that followed, one of the most determined enemies of piracy in the eastern seas, hunting down the rovers who threatened its trade with a ruthlessness born of the memory of how close Evry had brought it to ruin. And so the public part of the story came to its end, with a few men hanged, a crisis contained, an empire's anger appeased, and a great trade preserved. But the private part of the story, the part concerning the man himself, remained, and remains to this day, unresolved. For Henry Evry had escaped not only the gallows, but the very reach of history, and no one could say what had become of him. The trials had punished his shipmates, but he was gone, dissolved into rumour and legend, and it was precisely this, his complete and permanent escape, that ensured his name would outlast all the others, that he would be remembered when the men who were caught and hanged were forgotten, that he would become, in the imagination of later ages, the very pattern of the pirate who beat the whole world and got away. What actually became of him, and what grew up in the empty space where his true fate should have been, is the last thing this long story has to tell. And it is fitting that a tale so full of vanishing should end not with an answer, but with a mystery, and with the quiet contemplation of a sea that keeps its secrets, and a man who slipped beneath the surface of the known world, and was never seen to rise again. What became of Henry Evry is the great unanswered question of his story, and into the silence where the answer should be, the human imagination has poured, over the centuries, a whole flood of tales, some romantic, some sordid, none of them certain. The most colourful of these legends held that Evry did not fade into obscurity at all, but rather sailed to some distant and hidden place, and there set himself up as a king, ruling a pirate nation from a throne of plundered gold, married to a captured princess of the Mughal line, the founder of a dynasty of sea rovers who paid him tribute and did his bidding. This was the version that captured the popular imagination in the years after his disappearance, and it was elaborated in print and upon the stage into a full-blown romance, a fantasy of the poor sailor who had risen through daring and fortune to a station higher than any king in Europe. There was a play performed in London that told this story, and there were pamphlets and ballads that spread it through the taverns and the streets. And for a time, a great many people believed, or half believed, or wished to believe, that somewhere beyond the edge of the charts, the pirate. Every sat enthroned in barbaric splendor, having beaten the whole world and won for himself a kingdom out of the sea. It was a satisfying story, the more so because it could not be disproved, and it fed the deep human appetite for the triumph of the outsider, the ordinary man who breaks every rule and wins everything. The truth, so far as the truth can be guessed at, was almost certainly far quieter and far sadder than the legend, and it is the quieter version that most sober historians have come to favor. In this telling, Every made his way back to the British Isles, landing perhaps in Ireland and then crossing to England, and there he attempted to do the one thing that a pirate with a great fortune must do if he is ever to enjoy it, which is to convert his treasure into a form that can be safely held and spent without betraying its origins. The gold and jewels he had taken from the treasure ship were dangerous to hold in their raw state, for their very presence would have proclaimed his guilt, and so he needed to sell or exchange them through merchants who could turn them into ordinary money and property. He fell in, according to this account, with a group of merchants in the west of England, in the region of Bristol, to whom he entrusted a large part of his fortune for safekeeping and conversion. And these merchants, understanding perfectly that the man they were dealing with was a wanted pirate who could not go to the law, simply cheated him. They took his treasure and gave him little or nothing in return, and every, unable to complain or seek redress without revealing himself and delivering himself to the gallows, could do nothing but accept the loss. In this version of his end, the greatest pirate in history, the man who had taken the richest prize ever seized upon the sea, died in poverty in the west country of his birth, cheated of his fortune by respectable men who knew he could not fight back. So poor at the last, it was said, that he could not afford a coffin to be buried in. There is a grim and fitting justice in this second version of Every's fate, if it is true, a poetry of the kind that history occasionally supplies. The man who had built his whole enterprise upon the understanding that the world was a place where the strong cheated the weak and the clever cheated the honest, who had turned pirate in the first place because he felt himself cheated of his wages by the merchants of London, found himself in the end cheated in exactly the same way by the merchants of Bristol, robbed of his stolen fortune by men who used against him the very lawlessness he had lived by. He had placed himself outside the protection of the law, and so the law could not protect him when he in turn was robbed. And the fortune he had taken by force was taken from him by fraud, and he ended as he had begun, a poor man in the West Country with nothing to show for a lifetime at sea. Whether this is what truly happened, no one can say with certainty, for the record is silent, but it has the ring of truth about it, the sad plausibility that the romantic legend of the Pirate King entirely lacks. And it is the version that most who have studied the matter have come, reluctantly or otherwise, to believe. Between these two poles, the fantasy of the Pirate King and the sad tale of the cheated pauper, lie a scattering of other rumors and reported sightings, none of them reliable, that placed Every in various corners of the world in the years after his disappearance. Some said he had been seen in Ireland, living quietly under a false name. Some placed him back in the Caribbean, or in the American colonies, or in the ports of the Mediterranean. Some insisted he had gone back to sea under another identity and continued his old trade, undetected, for years. These reports, impossible to confirm, and mostly the product of the natural tendency of legend to sprout sightings of its hero in every likely place, add little to the solid record, but much to the atmosphere of mystery that surrounds his name. The sense that Every was everywhere and nowhere. A man who had so thoroughly escaped the grasp of history that he could be imagined into any corner of the world without fear of contradiction. The very multiplicity of the rumors is a kind of monument to the completeness of his vanishing. For a man whose fate is known does not accumulate such a wealth of contradictory legend. It is only the ones who truly disappear who become, in this way, a blank screen upon which the world projects its fantasies, and Henry Every disappeared as completely as any man in the history of the sea. The legend of Every, in all its forms, had a profound effect upon the age that followed him. For he became, more than any other single figure, the model of the successful pirate. The proof that the outlaw's road could lead not merely to a hangman's rope, but to fabulous wealth and a clean escape. In the years after his great theft, the waters of the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean saw a surge of piracy, as men inspired by his example, or by the legend of his example, took to the sea in search of their own fortunes, dreaming of their own treasure ships and their own vanishings into wealth and freedom. Every had shown them, or seemed to have shown them, that it could be done, that a bold man with a fast ship and a willing crew might strike at the richest prizes in the world and get away with a fortune. And this example, whether it rested upon the true story or upon the romantic legend, drew many after him onto the pirate's path. It is one of the strange consequences of his career that his escape, which was in reality probably followed by his ruin and lonely death, served as an inspiration to a whole generation of rovers, most of whom ended not as pirate kings, but at the end of a rope, deceived by the same legend that had first lured them out to sea. The myth of Henry Every, in this sense, was a kind of trap, a golden story that beckoned men toward a fate far darker than the one it seemed to promise. And the golden age of piracy that followed him was built, in no small part, upon the false hope that his legend had scattered across the seafaring world. Beyond the legend and its dark inheritance, the deed of Henry Every left marks upon the real history of the world that outlasted the man himself by generations. His capture of the treasure ship and the crisis it provoked taught the English East India Company a lesson it never forgot about the fragility of its position in the East and the terrible cost that the actions of a few outlaws could impose upon the whole enterprise of trade. In the years that followed, the company became a determined foe of piracy, using its growing power and its own armed ships to suppress the rovers who threatened its commerce. And this campaign against piracy became, in time, one of the threads by which the company drew itself deeper into the affairs of India, taking upon itself more and more of the functions of a government, until at last it became the ruler of much of the subcontinent. It would be too much to say that Henry Every caused the rise of British power in India, for that was the work of many hands and many decades. But his deed was one of the early jolts that pushed the company toward the militarization and the political ambition that would eventually transform it from a trading concern into an empire. The theft of the treasure ship, in other words, sent ripples forward through history far beyond anything its author could have imagined, and the pirate who wanted only to be rich played a small and unwitting part in the vast and troubled story of how a company of merchants came to rule a subcontinent. The manhunt for Every left its own mark as well, for it established, in a rough and early form, the principle that certain crimes were the concern of all nations, and that the pursuit of certain criminals might be coordinated across the whole of the civilized world. The pirate, in the thinking of the age, became the enemy of all mankind, a figure outside the protection of any law because he had set himself against the law of every nation. And the hunt for Every helped to fix this idea in the practice of governments and companies. It was a step, small and imperfect, toward the notion of an international order in which the powers of the world might act together against those who preyed upon the commerce that bound them all. And though the immediate hunt failed to catch its chief quarry, the precedent it set outlived that failure. In this sense, too, Henry Every occupies a curious and unintended place in history, not merely as a successful thief, but as the occasion of an early experiment in the coordination of justice across borders, an experiment provoked by the very completeness with which he had escaped the reach of any single authority. And yet, when all the consequences have been traced and all the significance weighed, what lingers most about the story of Henry Every is not its effect upon the fortunes of companies and empires, but its central and irreducible mystery, the fact of the man's disappearance, the way he stepped out of the light of history and was never certainly seen again. There is something in that vanishing that speaks to a deep place in the human imagination, something about the completeness of it, the finality, the sense of a man dissolving into the great anonymous mass of the world and leaving behind only a name and a legend and an empty space where his fate should be. The sea has swallowed many men, but it swallowed most of them in ways that could be recorded, in wrecks and drownings and the ordinary attrition of a dangerous trade. Henry Every it swallowed differently, not by killing him, so far as anyone knows, but by receiving him back into the ordinary world so completely that he left no trace. A man who had blazed briefly and brilliantly across the whole horizon of his age, and then faded, quietly and without a mark, into the common darkness from which he had come. It is a strange kind of ending, this ending that is not an ending but a fading, and it is perhaps the truest thing the story has to say about the sea and about time, that they take back everything in the end, the fortune and the fame and the very name of the man, and leave behind only the faint and fading ripples of a life that once disturbed the surface and then was gone. It is worth remembering, at the last, how the whole thing began in the green valleys of South Devon, with a boy who watched the ships and a poor sailor who felt himself cheated by the world, and how far that ordinary beginning travelled before it faded back into an ending just as obscure. Between the two obscurities, the unknown birth and the unknown death, there stretched a life that touched the courts of emperors and shook the fortunes of nations and left a name that would be spoken for centuries. And yet the man himself remained, at the beginning and at the end, an ordinary figure, a West Country seaman of no great birth and no certain grave, who happened, for one brilliant and terrible season, to hold the greatest treasure in the world in his hands. The gold is gone now, scattered and spent and melted down and lost, its jewels reset in other settings, its coin worn smooth in 10,000 transactions across 3 centuries. The ships are gone, the fast-sailing fancy and the great treasure vessel alike, rotted or broken up or sunk, their timbers returned to the sea that made them. The men are gone, the hanged and the escaped, the cheated and the drowned, their names mostly forgotten, their fortunes mostly wasted. And Henry Every is gone, most completely of all, gone so thoroughly that the very fact of his going has become the most memorable thing about him. The pirate who beat the world and vanished, whose true fate lies somewhere beneath the calm surface of the past, unrecoverable, at rest. The sea keeps its silence over all of it, as it keeps its silence over every voyage that has passed across it, and every ambition that has sailed out upon it and not returned. It does not remember the treasure or the crime or the cruelty or the daring. It does not distinguish the pirate from the pilgrim or the merchant from the king. It receives them all, the bold and the wronged and the forgotten alike, and closes over them, and moves on, indifferent and patient and vast. And the stories that men tell of what happened upon it are, in the end, the only monument that any of those lost voyages will ever have. The story of Henry Every is one such monument, a thing made of words and memory raised over an empty space where a man once was. And if it has been told here slowly and at length, it is because such stories deserve to be lingered over, to be given their full weight of time, to be allowed to fade toward their endings at the unhurried pace of the sea itself, which is never in any hurry, and which has, after all the time in the world. And so the tale comes to its quiet close, with the gold long scattered, and the ships long sunk, and the man long since gone into whatever silence received him. If this telling has kept you company through the still hours, and if the slow chronicle of a lost voyage is the kind of thing that eases the mind toward rest, then you are gently invited to return whenever the night is long. For there are many more of these lost voyages waiting to be told, many more ships that slipped over the horizon and did not come back, many more names that faded from the world and left only a story behind. Until then, may the sea be calm and the night be kind, and may the memory of Henry Every, the pirate who pulled off the greatest heist in the history of the sea and then vanished from the earth, drift with you gently down towards sleep.